So it's just like putting a blanket above my ceiling, and that reduces heat loss from my warm room. It reduces heat loss by reducing heat loss through conduction. So we've talked about radiation. I'm now going to talk a little bit about conduction. The glass wool insulating layer above my ceiling reduces heat loss by conduction. And glass wool insulation can be bought in Bhutan, down in Phuntsholling. It can be bought in India. But you don't have to use glass wool insulation. There's another very good material which is an excellent thermal insulator called expanded polystyrene. A problem in Bhutanese houses very often is that you get lots of gaps in the walls and between the wood and the plaster and the mud and this sort of thing, especially around windows. Now, there you can see light coming in through a gap in the wall. Now, what that means is that if it's windy and cold, wind will blow through that gap. The wind is cold air, and it blows cold air into the room. So part of the money that I spend on my electric heater is going to warm up the cold air which is blowing in through the room. Now, it's also true that mud is a better insulator than concrete. Wood is also a very good insulator. Now, if you've got somewhere where you've got wood and mud and concrete, if you place your hand against, for example, the wood and the mud, you'll find the wood feels warmer to your hand than the mud or the concrete does. The reason is the wood is a bad conductor of heat. So heat from your hand doesn't go through the wood very easily. Concrete or mud is a better conductor. Concrete is a good conductor, and so it takes heat away from your hand and your hand feels cold. What this tells us is that buildings made of concrete will get colder more quickly than buildings made of mud or made of wood. And this is something to think about when we build all our great new buildings out of concrete. They're going to be colder in winter than a mud house. And they're going to be hotter in summer because the heat will come in to the building. So mud, thick wood or mud walls have many advantages. First of all, of course, they are a local material. And secondly, a whole lot of Bhutanese architectural features are designed for wood, not for concrete. If you look at all the curvy bits by windows and this sort of thing, they arose because of the traditional building material of wood. They don't look quite so good in hard concrete. But also, from the point of view of keeping warm in winter, a concrete building is not so good as a mud or a wood building. However, even with a concrete building, one can do something to keep it a bit warmer. Some people put wooden panelling over their walls. And here's, in a moment, there'll be a shot of wooden panelling. Now, if behind the wooden panelling, between the wooden panelling and the concrete, if you put a thin layer of expanded polystyrene, that will significantly reduce heat loss through the walls. And then another way of reducing heat loss is by double glazing in the windows. Now, my windows here are made of 2 panes of glass. Now, I don't know whether the camera can show my fingers there are not touching, they're separated by about that much distance. 2 panes of glass, and in between a layer of air. Now, this is called
double glazing, and it is a very effective way of reducing heat loss due to conduction through the glass of the window. If you can imagine, this is very cold outside, this side is warm in my room. If it's just one pane of glass, a lot of heat from inside the room is conducted through the glass to the outside and lost to the outside cold air. If I put a double sheet of glass there, in between I get a thin layer of air. You will remember that air is a bad conductor. Therefore, heat energy from the warm room finds it more difficult to get to the outside because it has to go through this layer of air, which is a bad conductor. So, putting two sheets of glass with a thin air layer between is a good way of reducing heat loss from your warm room. It's important the panes of glass are only about that far apart. If they're that far, then I'll get heat loss between the panes of glass by convection, and I'll say a little bit more about convection in a moment. But double glazing, very simple to do, just two sheets of glass, a little bar of wood between them there. These were made by the local carpenter in the village. He couldn't work out why I wanted two sheets of glass here, but I did try to explain. So they're very simple to make, and they will significantly reduce heat loss from your room. And then, of course, if you try to make sure that the windows fit properly, there are no gaps. If I hadn't paid attention to thermal insulation of this room, it would very quickly lose heat to the outside because it's winter. However, because I've got the glass wool blanket on top, because I've got double glazing, because I've tried to block most of the cracks, although we saw I hadn't blocked one there, it means that I do not lose heat to the outside very rapidly from this room. So I hope this room is going to stay warm and cozy until the electricity comes back. Now, I've talked about radiation, I've talked about conduction, and I'm going to go on now and talk a little bit about convection. So, welcome into my little sitting room in my house way up in the Bagana Valley, and I just want to talk about one or two things which I've done to try to keep the place warm in winter. First of all, I heat by electricity for two reasons. First of all, it saves wood, and secondly, because electrical heating doesn't produce fumes and smoke. Now, as long as you've got a really good chimney on your Bakari, that's fine. But often Bakaris create smoke which is bad for the health and also bad for the decoration around the room. It makes everything dirty. Some people heat their homes by kerosene, with a kerosene heater. Now, the thing with a kerosene heater is that you really need to make sure you've got plenty of ventilation, fresh air coming in, because when kerosene burns, it can produce some very unpleasant fumes. So if you use a kerosene heater, make sure you've got a window open or something like that, so that you're getting fresh air. But there's a problem. If it's cold and you have to have a window open, then you're going to lose a lot of heat through the window, and this means that you'll spend an awful lot of money burning kerosene, keeping the room warm. Now, I heat with one small electric heater. I know there are two in the corner there, but I only use one. And this room stays beautifully warm, and the room outside, for a number of reasons. First of all, the room is small. The bigger the room, the more difficult it is to heat. And I'm sure you'll have noticed that if you go into some modern buildings and halls where there are very big rooms, outside it may be a beautifully sunny day in winter, But once you go inside, it's like walking into a refrigerator, because it is very difficult to heat a very large hall full of air. There are many sources of heat loss. So first of all, a small room. Now, secondly, I talked about the blanket that I've put over the top of my ceiling. So up here, above the ceiling, there is this thick layer of the glass wool thermal insulation that I talked about. And that forms a blanket across the ceiling, which stops heat from the room escaping into the outside air. Now, that blanket is made of glass fibers, all bundled together. And in between the glass fibers is air. So actually, looking at that thick layer of glass fiber, most of it is air. Now, an important principle to remember for thermal insulation is that air, or gases for that matter, but air is a bad conductor of heat. So if I want to stop heat loss, then I try to arrange for there to be a lot of air around. And I'm just going to get my fleece. Hang on a moment. So I couldn't find my fleece, but what I can find is my woolen scarf, which illustrates the principle very well. Now, if we look at this woolen scarf, you know when I wrap this around my neck, it's very warm. And the reason is, it's made of wool fibers, not glass fiber, but wool fiber. And in the scarf, in the material of the scarf, the wool fiber traps lots of tiny little pockets of air. And air is a very bad conductor of heat. And so when I wrap this around me, the heat loss from my body is reduced because the air in the scarf is a bad conductor of heat. So conduction heat loss from my body is reduced by the air contained in the scarf trapped there by the wool fibers. And one of the grandchildren has left their fleece, not fleece, their lovely puffer jacket around here. Now, this is a very good example of reducing heat loss by conduction, because you'll notice that, first of all, this is very, very light. Secondly, it's got puffed up pockets which contain lots of air. You can feel it. It's almost like a balloon, lots of air. And there are little fibers inside, just like with my wool scarf, which hold these pockets of air. So when you put these on, you've in effect got a layer of air over your skin. Air, remember, like all gases, is a bad conductor of heat. Heat does not travel easily through air, and so this stops heat being lost from your body to the cold outside. So this sort of clothing is excellent for reducing heat loss by conduction. Now, I want to talk a little bit about convection. Now, convection is different from radiation and conduction. It's another way in which heat energy can get from one thing to another, but it only works in liquids and gases. And I'm going to try and explain what I mean in a moment by heating up a glass jug with some water in. And convection happens because when I heat up a liquid, when the temperature of a liquid gets hotter, when the temperature rises, then the hot liquid expands, it gets less dense than cold liquid, and so the hot liquid floats up to the surface. Now, let's take our coffee jug and let's put it over the candle. The candle is heating the liquid in the middle of the glass jug. That liquid that's getting hot expands. it becomes less dense, it therefore floats up to the surface, and then you can see the liquid moving like this. Hot liquid rising, cold liquid falling, and you get a convection current like that. I'm going to try and put a bit of soya sauce in the water to see whether we can see any convection current. It probably won't work, but let's try. Well, no. I'm going to have to go to a school laboratory and get a little crystal of potassium permanganate and do this in a place where I can pop potassium permanganate in there, which makes a very deep blue color to the water, and you see the water above the flame rising and the cold water falling, and we get a convection current like that. Convection. Now, soya sauce doesn't work. I'm sorry about that, but I'll show you a little bit later with potassium permanganate. So let's put that down now. Now, we don't usually boil our water by putting it in a glass jug on top of the candle flame. We actually use an electric kettle. But let me talk about conduction, convection, and radiation in an electric kettle. I've just boiled some water in this, and I'm going to have my morning coffee, and we can see the water is very hot. Even though I actually boiled this 10 minutes ago, the water has stayed hot inside the electric kettle. Now, the electric kettle. First of all, an electric kettle has got thick walls, and the inside here, in between in the thick walls there, is expanded polystyrene, which is a very bad conductor of heat, so it's a very good insulator. So it stops heat going from inside to the kettle to the outside. It stops conduction of heat. Now, inside is boiling water. If I were to stick my hand inside, I would scald my hand because there's boiling water in there. But the outside of the kettle is really quite cool because of this thick layer of insulator, expanded polystyrene, between the inside and the outside of the kettle. So this polystyrene layer reduces heat loss from inside to outside by conduction. Well, what about radiation? You'll notice the outside of the copper kettle is silver. Now, you'll remember I said that silvery things reflect heat. They also, because it's silver, it will reflect heat back inside the kettle. Just like my emergency blanket, it reflects heat back inside the kettle. But there's another funny thing. You may have learned in school, silver things are bad radiators of heat. In other words, they give out heat very badly. They are bad radiators. Black things are very good radiators of heat. So the silver sides of the kettle reflect some of the heat back into the kettle, stop it escaping out, but also they don't radiate heat out very much. And if I hold my hands here, I feel hardly no radiant heat energy. So conduction stopped by a layer of expanded polystyrene, radiation reduced by having silver sides. And if you look in an electric kettle, you'll see that the heating element is at the bottom. So it heats up water at the bottom, the hot water rises, and the cold water falls to get heated up, and so I get convection currents inside the water, which heat up the whole of the water rapidly. Convection currents. If I had the heating element at the top, it would heat the water at the top, and the water at the top would stay at the top. It wouldn't fall down, and so it would take a long time for the heat to conduct through the water down to the bottom. But because I get convection currents by having the heater at the bottom, I heat up the water very quickly. So an electric kettle is a very good example of how conduction, convection, and radiation, an understanding of those three ways of transferring heat energy, can be used to make an electric kettle an efficient heater of water and a container which will keep the water hot for a long time, so that even 20 minutes after boiling my kettle, I can still get hot water for my coffee. Conduction, convection, and radiation, the three ways in which heat energy transfers from one place to another, from one substance to another. In a very quick summary, to keep your house warm, to reduce your heating bills, to reduce the amount of wood you have to burn, to reduce the amount of electricity you use, things like an insulating blanket over the roof, not over the outside roof, over the ceiling of rooms you want to keep warm. Secondly, stop all the gaps where cold air can blow in. Thirdly, think about insulating the walls. A thin layer of expanded polystyrene underneath some wooden panelling forms an excellent thermal insulation. Remember, it reduces heat loss by conduction.